And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. And on the last podcast, we looked at an example. We're actually looking at it. You're looking at it right now. We looked at an example where I gave you the change in initial spending. Let me just switch my colors up here. We did an example where we had a change in the initial spending, and I gave you the marginal propensity to consume, and then you had to use that to calculate the multiplier and therefore find what would be the change in the gross domestic product in response. And by the way, if this change in initial spending was negative, then this curve would shift down, and it would be a negative number times the multiplier, which would give you a negative GDP. GDP would go down. Okay, so that's just adding a negative number. Now, what I'm going to do this time on this video is the same concept, only now I'm going to start with this. I'm going to give you the change in the gross domestic product. That's the more normal thing that an economist might have to deal with. So let's clear this up, and let's start this over. Let's say that we're here at some gross domestic product Y1, and let's say that the problem with that is that at that equilibrium gross domestic product Y1, we are below our potential gross domestic product. We are below our potential gross domestic product. So here we have some unemployment rate of U1. Here we have an unemployment rate of U2. Now, remember what we said in the last video, this unemployment rate is higher than this one. Okay, so U1 is greater than U2. And that's we're not happy with that. We're at a low level of equilibrium gross domestic product with a high level of unemployment. In fact, we have cyclical unemployment. Maybe we're in a recession or something like that. And we want to get out of the recession. So we want to increase the GDP from Y1 up here to our potential. Okay? So that would be the change in the gross domestic product that we want. So let's write down the formula over here. So we have the change in the gross domestic product is equal to the multiplier effect times the change in initial spending. Okay? Times change in initial spending. Now, as an economist, what I might do is I might come in and say, well, how big is our GDP gap? So this is our potential GDP, and our production below it is what is called this change in Y that I need here. This is called the GDP gap. The GDP gap. And the way I'm going to say it is the GDP gap is really any difference between your actual gross domestic product at equilibrium and your potential. Okay, that's a GDP gap. The GDP gap could go the other way if your potential was down here, and I'm going to erase this here in a moment, but if your potential was down here, then between the actual GDP of Y1 and here, that would also be a GDP gap going the other direction. All right, so the GDP gap is any difference between the actual GDP and the potential GDP. So I wanted to get rid of that, and let's go back to this example where we have a GDP gap where our actual gross domestic product is below potential, and as a result of that, our unemployment rate is higher than it would be if we were producing at our potential GDP. So unemployment 1 is greater than unemployment 2. So we have a relatively high unemployment rate at a low level of production. So we want to close this GDP gap. We want to close this GDP gap. And let's say we need a number for it. Let's say this GDP gap is $800 million. We are producing $800 million below our potential. This is some potential GDP. This is where we actually are, and the difference between the two is 800 million. So let's record that over here. So our GDP gap that we would like to close is $800 million. We have an $800 million GDP gap. All right, now we can work this formula in reverse. If I know the marginal propensity to consume, let's say the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, then I can figure out, I can calculate the multiplier, because that's going to be 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. And so I punch that in my calculator, and I get that the multiplier effect is 5. So I can plug that in here for the multiplier effect. So if we have a GDP gap of 800 million, we want to increase gross domestic product by 800 million, and we know that the multiplier effect is 5. Well, then we can find the change in initial spending necessary to do that. And the change in the initial spending necessary to do that would be 800 divided by 5. 800 divided by 5 would be 160 million. So all we did was we just reversed this process. On the previous example, I gave you the change in initial spending. Now here I gave you the change in GDP that we want, and we had to figure out how much spending we needed in order to get that $800 million increase in gross domestic product. So here was the $800 million increase in GDP that we wanted. That was right here. And in order to make that happen, we needed increase in spending. In this case, maybe we would have an increase in government spending, and the increase or change in initial spending is 160 million, and that shifts up the curve. And when it shifts up the curve, we then have the multiplier effect, and through the multiplier effect, the multiplier, which is equal in this example to 5, we get the $160 million increase in spending. Through the multiplier effect, increases GDP by 800 million and closes the GDP gap. So you see how we work that in reverse. I gave you the change in government spending. I gave you the change in gross domestic product first. This is how much we wanted to change the gross domestic product, and now you had to figure out how much initial spending. In this example, it'll be how much government spending did we need in order to close that gap. So then we could go to the lawmakers, and we could say, hey, the real world event is we need that government stimulus package that we talked about. We need the government stimulus package, and we can now give them a number. We need a government stimulus package equal to 160 million. Government stimulus package of $160 million. And then that would be a change in government spending that would shift up the aggregate expenditure curve by the $160 million. And then through the multiplier effect, that would increase the gross domestic product specifically by $800 million. So in short, I could here's the thing. I could give you any two of these three variables, and you have to find the other one. I could give you any two of these three variables, and then you would have to find the other one. Okay, so that's just doing some basic algebra applied to the economics. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan on another podcast. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you on the next podcast.